Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. With your host, Dr. Drumm McNaughton, CEO of The Change Leader, a consultancy that helps higher ed leaders holistically transform their institutions. Learn more at changinghighered.com. And now, here's your host, Drumm McNaughton.
Thank you, David. Our guest today is Dr. Kim Hadley, Vice President for Finance and Administration at John Brown University. Dr. Hadley is a finance expert. She's had a career in public accounting, internal audit, multiple teaching and administrative positions, and she's been CFO for a long time. She served as chair for the Council for Christian Colleges and Universities CFO Commission and also completed a 3-year term on the Small Institution Council for NACUBO and currently serves on the Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability, ECFA, their Standards Advisory Committee. She joins us today to talk about the outlook for higher ed and what institutions can do to shore up their bottom lines. Kim, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
And I am glad to have you as well. You come highly recommended from a good colleague of ours, Rob Hartman, who is an exceptional CFO. And, you know, Rob, I've known Rob now for 3-4 years through ABAC. I know he sits on the board there. How long have you known Rob?
Known Rob well, probably 5 years. Known of Rob 10 years. Mm-hmm. So go back some years. Yeah, most definitely. And, you know, to me, he is the CFO's CFO, you know, not unlike you. Well, I wouldn't compare us because I don't know that I have the energy level that Rob has. So he's great. This is true. He's great. This is true. And I think Rob's hair is longer than yours is, too. Yes, I think that is true. That is true. I keep threatening my wife that I'm going to grow a ponytail and, you know, because when I grow up, I want to look like Rob, but, yeah. You know. Yes. Well, he is a extraordinary CFO and a very positive person. So I have the highest respect for Rob. Absolutely. You know, just wonderful having him on the show as a guest. He's been on a couple of times. But what we're going to talk about today is what we've learned from the pandemic that can help us transform higher education. Now, you've been with John Brown for a few years now, correct? That is correct. I began teaching as an adjunct in 1996, so 25 years ago. But I actually have been CFO since 2004. So, you know, I've been in my current role for a number of years now. So you started teaching when you were what, 12, 13? Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely. No, 27. So, that wasn't an invitation for you to tell me how old you are. You know, age has never been an issue for me. I don't mind people knowing my age. So. Well, very good. So CFO since the early 2000s. You've seen a lot. You were there during the Great Recession, you know, 2008, which, you know, certainly hit institutions' bottom lines. But my guess is the pandemic has been different. The uncertainty has been greater. I would say on a normal year, you have variance around what you can predict. With the pandemic, just because it was so many unknowns. With the Great Recession, I mean, it was a financial risk. With the pandemic, there, I would say, was a higher level of operational risk along with financial risk. So there was more variance around what we could expect, just so many more unknowns, and a lot more unknown about what you would be allowed to do, even from external forces that might be able to control your operations. So variety of unknowns from more angles, I would say. And we're going to touch on the enterprise risk management aspects, you know, in a little bit, but I am guessing that with the Great Recession, the standard planning from, you know, you take a look at what your enrollment is, your projections, you go 10% above, 10% below, and, you know, that's pretty good for risk management. But I'm guessing the pandemic wasn't like that at all. Right. With the Great Recession, we knew it would hit the endowment. We knew it would hit families' ability to pay. So I think it was pretty standard across the board with institutions that their unfunded discount rates went up during that time. But it wasn't the level of variability, which is I think what you're getting at with the pandemic, was the range of what could happen was so much more variable. So yes, that was the biggest difference.
Yeah. So John Brown, the pandemic hit March 2020. You guys did some mostly common things. You delayed the return of, from spring break by a week. Everything went online. So walk us through the process that you did for March, for your summer terms, fall term, and even spring term for this year, please.
So leading up to March 17th, we sent students home. But leading up to that was just the knowledge of a global pandemic kind of forming. We had formed a COVID task force on campus that really came out of our emergency response team. So we had been meeting and planning and thinking through leading up to March 17th. So it wasn't like the first time we met was March 17th. But March 17th, our students went home. It was spring break. We decided to extend and give them 2 weeks of spring break, mainly to allow our faculty an extra week to prepare their classes to go into emergency remote learning. Online learning in its true form has pedagogy that goes with it that you're not able to turn around and get there within a week. So we actually refer to that as emergency remote learning.
Yeah. Now, wait a minute here. I just heard you use an academic term. Pedagogy.
Right.
This is very unusual for a CFO to be using terms like this.
Well, I came out of academics, so
okay.
I spent 15 years in the classroom from the time I was first teaching until I became CFO. So, yeah. So
you're seeing things from both sides of the fence then.
Right. Our faculty really did amazing efforts and really stepped up because they had to convert classes to emergency learning platform. But then for the summer term, so we wanted students to have the best experience they could have when that emergency learning came up. And that's why we gave faculty an extra week and the students an extra week. We wanted to just give the best learning experience we could. So we completed the term that way. And we understood our students were home, probably not being able to work summer jobs and probably not being able to fulfill internship arrangements they had. So we thought a good service to them would be able to allow them to take classes online with great, solid online pedagogy in the summer. And so we had our full-time faculty convert a lot of our classes. Really, they did a Herculean effort of doing this, converted many classes to really solid online experiences for our students. And we offered 2 summer terms. We called it JBU at Home. And it was full-time faculty, had a great response from our traditional undergraduate students. And it allowed us to recover revenue and also the bigger thing, 3 things: serve students well, because we did it at a discounted rate. We did it at our normal online program rate, not our traditional undergraduate rate. So they were able to take classes at a discounted rate, classes that they would need for their programs from full-time faculty. So it served students well. It allowed us to generate a new revenue stream over the summer because we were in this really unknown time, right? So any new revenue was a good thing. But it also allowed students to stay connected to JBU during this uncertainty because we wanted to make sure students stayed connected so they would be more likely to return in the fall.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like by doing 2 summer terms instead of the usual 1, you were able to help students accelerate their graduation rate. Is that true?
That students very much could have. We normally just offered 1 May term. And so this was very different in that we had 2 terms, much more broad offering of classes, and some of our best faculty teaching them. So yeah, it was a great service to students.
Very nice. So fast forward to fall term.
So fall, we started earlier in fall than what we normally did. We shifted our calendar because we wanted to be able to send students home at Thanksgiving. Because we didn't necessarily have the insight to think, oh, COVID's going to spike during the November, December, January time period. We just really thought some of the things we did, because we had 97, 98% of our classes on ground in person for our traditional undergraduate. But how we did that is we used these all these different alternative spaces, turned them into classrooms. Our cafeteria, you could order your meal to go on an app, and we had all these tents set up outside where people could eat outside because it was safer. And that's easier to do in Arkansas in August and May than it is in January and December. It's rather cold. But we also thought there's flu season, and if nothing else, flu symptoms can be confused with COVID symptoms. And so we just thought it would be best. So we started early. We didn't have the traditional fall break that we would normally have. And we dismissed students for the fall term at Thanksgiving. They completed some final assignments and final exams remotely, but they did not come back on campus until February 1. So we shifted our spring semester later and our fall semester earlier to give this gap. And it turned out to be a providence for us because January was a peak COVID time and we didn't have students on campus. We did offer an online January term, what we call a J term, and that's not something we normally have. But because we shifted our semester, we were able to offer that to our students. And once again, it was a good offering to our students at a lower rate and with great faculty and a good offering of classes. But we started later because, once again, it's easier to have students in tents outside eating in May than it is in January in Arkansas.
Oh, you mean they don't want the snow as a condiment?
No, not even with the propane heaters or whatever. But so then we didn't do our traditional spring break. We had some shorter breaks here and there, so students wouldn't necessarily all pack up and go several states away and be, increased exposure. So we had smaller breaks, started later, ended later. And, it was remarkable. We had a very good year.
Mm-hmm. Now, for summer for this year, did you go to 2 terms or did you just do the single summer term?
We have our online offerings, but probably not to the extent that we had last summer. So we have online offerings, but students want to do internships. They want to travel. They want to do the things that they didn't get to do last year. So although we're offering classes, it's certainly not the extent that we were offering before.
Of course. Well, and I am guessing too that you've noticed a demographic shift with respect to your enrollments.
Well, I would say that we know what has hit the coastal areas first will be coming our way in terms of there are demographic changes that we haven't yet experienced, but we know that are coming. And that would be within, reduced high school graduations and things like that. We had been thinking about what was going to be happening demographic wise before the pandemic. And I think it's only, I would say we would even have more of a focus of that now.
Mm-hmm. But for example, most of your students are now living, whether they're doing online or not, they're living closer to your institution than they were. I think we had a conversation, we said that most of the students are within 50 miles of the institution.
I think where we're seeing that is in the online programs, not necessarily in our traditional undergraduate students.
Okay.
Nationally, there's a lot of studies out there that have indicated that over time, as online programs have developed, students are gravitating toward known brands, if you will. So they're taking online classes within, practically a 50-mile radius of a known institution that they know because they're geographically close to, or they're taking classes from very large institutions that have strong brands. So when online classes first began, I think people thought, oh, we could be providing online classes to someone, just all over the world. It really hasn't panned out that way. It becoming, increasingly so that it is students take online classes from institutions where they recognize the brand. And that would either be geographically or because it's a very large institution. And that's true in our online and graduate programs for sure. And so what I think is, as the pandemic happened, our traditional undergraduate students clearly communicated that they prefer on-ground courses, but I think they have a higher tolerance for receiving some of their education online. And it's just super convenient and works well with if that education online can be from JBU because we are their institution or they're known. But if it wouldn't be from JBU, it would be from some other geographically close or well-known brand, large brand.
Mm-hmm. Which kind of brings us to some of the learnings and some of the things, the innovation that institutions had to do during the pandemic is, to me, one of the bright spots. If you can, there's, silver linings in every thunderstorm.
Right.
But the collaboration with other institutions, the innovation is really important, I think.
We were doing collaboration and innovation, I think, before. I think we will probably look to do even more of that afterwards because it was so important during the pandemic. One of the things during the pandemic, I would say too, we leveraged things that had begun before the pandemic, things that we would never imagine to have used the way we used. So several years ago, we got a grant to develop an online program. Well, that was primarily intended for this online education population. Well, what happened during the pandemic is we pivoted that and served our traditional undergraduate student population through the backbones of that online program that we had developed through a grant. So providentially, we had this grant that helped us. So we were able to pivot and use JBU classes. Had we not had that grant, I think we would have reached out to consortiums that we're part of, Acadium being one, where basically we have been part of that because other institutions can take open seats in a different institution's online class. So students can basically it's a marketplace for exchanging open seats. We really haven't had a lot of traction on that. But during the pandemic, had we not had our online backbone already set up, that would have been our lifeline. Mm-hmm. That would have been how we would have offered the classes. So I think those collaborations are super important. But other things that we have, I think that's been important and will become more important to us, we collaborate with other institutions. And I think this will be even more because students have a tolerance for online classes now. So I think institutions need to think about, and we're thinking about more and more, how do you lift a major up without having all the fixed cost of standing that major up? And you can do that by collaborating with another institution that has a real strength in a particular program where your students take most of their classes, on ground at your institution, but they pick up some of those higher level major classes virtually through an institution that has a strength in that area. So, and this prior to the pandemic, we were doing this, but I think it will become even more important afterwards. But we have a criminal justice program where students take online classes through another college that has a strength in that area. We offer a cyber master's, but we can offer a cyber undergrad through partnership with another institution. Our outdoor ministries major, now those majors have an opportunity to pick up disaster relief and emergency management through a partnership with another institution that has a strength in that area. There's yet another institution that their students take some of our construction management classes because we have a strength in that area. So they're taking construction management classes online. We were doing this already, but I think that what's going to become even more important because students now they want most of their education in person. That's what our students are telling us. But they have this higher tolerance to get some of their education virtually. So I think there's an opportunity for institutions to collaborate. We all can't be the best at everything, but we can serve our students well by determining what are our strengths, and then what do we collaborate with another institution to gain for our students. I think that's a way to offer new programs without all the cost structure of a new program. And I think institutions need to begin to think more collaboratively about this.
Well, I think you're absolutely right in that. It makes perfect sense if you can partner with somebody else who is an expert in that area, and you've got the online delivery systems. I mean, undergraduates are more open to the online than they used to be, but graduates are even more open than undergraduates are.
Right. But I think with that combination for undergrads where they're saying, well, I don't want all of my program online, but they're willing to have some of it online.
Yes.
So,
yeah, it's, hybrid model, a few classes here and there, whatnot, to be able to do that. And with some of the new guidelines from the Department of Education, it makes it easier from an accreditation perspective to bring in classes from another institution that will work with your own degree programs.
Right. And you can work on, I think you have to define the path of at which point are these students, which institution students, and who's transferring credit and those sorts of things. But I think that is an opportunity to look at, okay, what the path should be. Someone shouldn't automatically say no for fear that accreditation wouldn't work, but working through the path. What's the path that will end in yes? I think that's the important thing.
Exactly. And now there's been a lot of other changes with structures, with technologies. When we spoke before, you talked about having OWL cameras.
Yes. Well, this was really, we had an employee in our IT area that, we were trying to figure out how do we pivot, right? And there was a time period we didn't know if we'd be able to have in-person classes, but if we were to have in-person classes, how do you have in-person classes where a student could, if they needed to quarantine, could still stay up to date and in the class? And these OWL cameras, they're not perfect. It's not like being exactly in the classroom, but they're pretty good because they travel and follow the speaker as you would imagine an owl, the animal, the bird, moving to follow the speaker. These OWL cameras do that. So students who needed to be quarantined or isolated could still attend class. We put OWL cameras all through our campus, and that required training faculty, the actual ordering, installation, but they were phenomenal and a big key ingredient in our ability to be able to serve students well during this time.
And do you see a use for this going forward?
Well, sure. We're keeping those in our classrooms this year particularly because, you just don't know when a spike might occur. But also, I think it would be helpful just normally, like you might have athletes traveling for athletic events. And so I think there could be some uses for that. And certainly, if you develop more hybrid kind of formatting classes particularly with, students from another institution joining, the OWL camera is a good solution for that.
Mm-hmm. I hadn't thought about using it for, traveling athletes. That's brilliant.
I think we now know what technology we have, and so I think there will be some uses of that, even in just the traditional undergraduate format.
Mm-hmm. So let's swap horses just a little bit and get into the contingency and the cash flow planning of it. The meat of what a CFO had to deal with during the pandemic.
Right. So I have spreadsheets dated April 3rd and 4th that still give me a little heart flutter when I look at the name of the spreadsheets on the file. Because that's pretty fresh into the pandemic, and we really didn't know what was coming. But with the work of our financial analyst and our controller and I, the team of the three of us, we put together some scenario planning. We did everything from looking at what if our traditional undergraduates had to have a fall A and a fall B term so that if we needed to pivot and go home halfway through the semester, what would that look like? I think I started out with 8 different scenarios. We pared it down, and I think when we got to the board level, we presented 4 of potential outcomes. One of them, I think my worst case scenario is if the state government didn't allow us to have on-ground classes and we had to have online classes at the reduced online rate, but only 50% of the students came for those classes. I think that was my worst case scenario, which was pretty dramatic.
That's ugly.
And then the best case scenario was that we'd be like maybe 5% down. I don't think I even had a scenario that said we would be normal. That wasn't even, if you looked at a bell curve probability, that the probability wasn't out there. But we pared it down to about 4 scenarios that we thought were, pretty likely, that in 1 or 2 of them we thought were more likely than not. And we presented that to the board. We presented it during the summer. We updated for, when it got closer. We definitely kept our board in the conversation. The cash flow wise, based on those different scenarios for like revenue and expenses, I also looked at what does that mean for cash flow? And I went to our bank and I said, I want to, as a contingency, increase our line of credit 5 times what it is now. Now, this is a line of credit we really hadn't used at all in over 2 decades. But I was saying, because there's so much variability in the potential outcomes. And so I put together, a executive summary showing, and I went through this with our bank, and I outlined if this happens, then this happens to cash flow. And I was clear with them that the line of credit wouldn't be my solution. It would give us time to be able to make better strategic decisions on how to respond. It wouldn't keep us from making the tough decisions. So we went through that. I was able to get that approved. It had to go through the super committee of the bank, the super loan committee. So it was not a slam dunk. It was very hard work, answering a lot of questions, but we got it. And from what I understand, we got the increase in our line of credit when many other institutions' lines of credit were being dropped by their bank. So I count that as a great blessing that we were able to do that. And I also count it as a great blessing that we never had to use it this year. So we had it. I'm dropping it this year. I'm dropping it in half. I don't think we'll need the full span of what I was preparing for, but it is still much more than it's over double what I normally carried.
Mm-hmm.
That's a lot of credit.
Well, the other thing that, that you told me you guys did was you identified different endowment donations that could be used for, contingency reasons.
Well, what I did is I went through all the assets of the university and I looked at what's the restrictions. So if it was donor designated, I basically put that in a bucket as, don't touch unless you had a donor conversation, right? And then I went to, and same with government, if there was any kind of government restrictions on it. But then there was quasi-endowment, which is board designated. It's not restricted by a donor. It can be undesignated by the board if you need to. I looked at that. I also looked at various departmental reserves that, departments hold, and there's really no donor restriction on that. So I put all of our assets into categories of how easily converted and liquidated to cash to be used for emergencies. And that was all laid before our bank and explained. I would use, before I tapped the line of credit, I would use this, this, and this, and this to cash flow. And gratefully, none of that contingency planning had to be used. But it put us all at ease that we had those plans.
Which is huge. And of course, you've got to get your board involved. They need to understand. But I think your board is pretty unique in that you were able to have the conversations with them and they understood the criticality of cash flow. Right.
We have a really strong board, a lot of really strong business knowledge on our board. But we had also, and we have financial and budget conversations ongoing with our board. But also leading up to this, we had done, and I think this is equally as important, we had done budget education with our faculty and staff. And I had done that through these, what I called Budget 1-on-1. I viewed it as inoculation, which takes on a whole new meaning now. But when I first rolled this out 2 or 3 years ago, I said it's budget inoculation. I give you a small dose over a long period of time, and hopefully at the end of this, every person on campus would understand the main levers of our budget. So my goal was to have every person on campus understand what net revenue meant. What does that mean? Have a general understanding of how the endowment works. Have a general understanding of what's the difference between capital budgeting and operational budgeting. And so it was general understanding with lots of pictures and small amounts of information at a time over a long period of time. But interestingly enough, when I started at that about 2 or 3 years ago, I saw institutions having to make cuts and having to make difficult decisions. And I thought, the world of higher education, I just thought at some point JBU is going to have to make difficult decisions. And I don't want to start that conversation by having to explain the basics of the budget model. I want to already have that in place and have a level of trust and transparency into the budget process. So when the time comes that we have to make difficult decisions, that's where I'm starting from, where I have our faculty and staff understanding the general basics of the budget. So that was super helpful. Of course, the board, we have great, strong board members that come from a lot of different segments, industry segments that, really help us do well in running JBU. But I think it was equally important is that our faculty and staff had some level of understanding of the budget before we did that.
So, through this transparency, you were able to build a culture of collaboration.
Mm-hmm. Right. So, and that was super important because I mentioned earlier that our full-time faculty taught classes in the summer, which they didn't. March 17, no one was planning to teach these summer online classes. So our full-time faculty taught these summer online classes and initially agreed to teach them at reduced rates, like much lower than their normal compensation for overload. Now, I say initially because our year ended so well, we were able to restore their normal compensation for those classes, but they didn't know that would ever happen when they agreed to do it. And so the reason we were able to offer those lower priced online classes with full-time faculty was truly through the Herculean efforts of our faculty, because they developed classes with great online pedagogy, and we offered them at a lower rate because they were willing to teach at a lower rate. Now that is amazing. That's just really not a norm in the broader higher ed, but our faculty were amazing and responded that way. Also, we don't have tenure, but we have multi-year contracts. Our faculty agreed to sign a contract that allowed us to reduce their compensation if we needed to get through the year.
Wow.
So that's a level of trust that's not built overnight. Now, gratefully, we didn't have to reduce their compensation, and gratefully, we were able to restore the 1% salary increase on top of that. We didn't have to reduce their salary. We did reduce our 403B match from 7%, so our retirement plan match, from 7% down to 4%. But once again, by March of 2021, we restored all of that to our employees. So we looked back and said, what were the sacrifices that our employees made during this year to help us get through? And we restored it. We restored all of it. Now, Cabinet, of course, led with compensation. We took compensation cuts before we asked anyone else to take responsibilities. But the board restored everything to everyone, and we also were able to give bonuses. Over the year, we gave a $1,000 bonus to every full-time employee and $500 bonus to every part-time employee. So, but we didn't. No one knew that was not guaranteed when they made the sacrifices. They made the sacrifices, understanding that very well might be the reality. So,
well, what I'm hearing is a couple of things. One, a tremendous amount of transparency and collaboration that built trust, but also in the conversation that we had before, there was a laser focus on the mission and what made you distinctive and different.
Right.
And that led to some program reprioritization.
Right. That is true. We absolutely did. We actually had a center on our campus that was donor funded. We went to the donor family, and because it was not, although it had a wonderful mission, the mission wasn't as connected to our traditional undergraduate student. So we actually, the employees of that center ended up taking that programming and taking it and starting on their own, and the endowment for that center was turned back to our traditional undergraduate students in serving a particular program. So that is an example of where we did have a donor family conversation and reprioritized, money in keeping with donor intent, but just to a different department in the university that could carry that out. But we also looked at programs where there was low enrollment, and we have this conversation going on all the time. Where are we serving students best, and where are we not, and where is the enrollment? And so the reprioritization, the teaching out of majors that, are not sustainable, we have that conversation all the time, but we continued it through the pandemic.
Wow, that's good. Well, Kim, as much as I am enjoying this conversation, we are getting down to the end of our time. And so, as we always do, what are 3 takeaways for higher ed presidents, boards, and CFOs?
I think that going forward, we're going to have to, your mission, what is your mission, and be laser focused on your mission. Not all of us can be the best at everything. What are we great at, and what differentiates us? In our case, we, have a Christian mission that is really important. So that laser focus on your mission, and what does that really mean? And then secondly, I think we've got to figure out how to be more collaborative among institutions. And I think then contingency and flexibility planning is not going to go away. We had an enterprise risk management matrix heat map, if you will. Pandemic was not on that.
Oops.
So I think your biggest risk is the risk you don't see coming.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to have more contingency planning, more flexibility built into your financial models to be able to withstand the unknown that you don't know where to put on your heat map because you don't see it coming at all. So those would be my 3.
Thank you. I'm curious on your heat maps. Did you do a 2x2 matrix, or did you do something different?
2x2. Yeah.
Okay.
2x2.
Yeah.
And we update it at the cabinet level. We've had board conversations about it, but I will tell you, we did talk about our biggest risk was the risk we didn't see. No one knew what to name that because we didn't see it. Well, pandemic is what you would call it.
And 10 years from now, there will be another, unknown occurrence.
Exactly.
This is why they call them disruptions.
And why we have to have more contingency and flexibility in our models.
Absolutely. And so what's next for you? What's next for JBU?
Well, I think JBU is continuing to serve our students. We're planning for next fall and looking at what that looks like in designs of classrooms. And we are continuing to do program prioritization on an ongoing basis. Steady the course for JBU. I think we will continue to work on be a culture of transparency and collaboration. And I'm just really grateful for our faculty and staff. For me, I love JBU. I think I'll be a lifer. So continuing to help us do well as we move forward.
Well, very good. Kim, thank you so much for being on the program. I think this has been wonderful, and you've given some great tips on how to be able to innovate higher ed and take some of the lessons that you learned during the pandemic and move them forward. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Thanks for listening this week. And a special thank you to this week's special guest, Dr. Kim Hadley, and for her sharing her perspective on what's going on in higher ed finance and what institutions can do to ride out the transformation while shoring up their bottom lines. Our next guest is Jamie Cassup. He's a higher ed innovator and former education evangelist at Google. Jamie's the poster child for what higher education can do to raise someone out of poverty, and he'll be joining us to tell his story and how university presidents should focus on changing the narrative on the value of higher education to something that's truthful instead of the gaslighting we've seen in the world when it comes to the value of education and so many other things that we're seeing nowadays.
Changing Higher Ed is a production of The Change Leader, a consultancy committed to transforming higher ed institutions. Find more information about this topic, along with show notes on this episode at changinghighered.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to the show, and we would also value your honest rating and review. Email any questions, comments, or recommendations for topics or guests to podcast@changinghighered.com. Changing Higher Ed is produced and hosted by Dr. Drumm McNaughton, post-production by David L. White.